Iron Ridge Base was just another assignment on a Tuesday morning, until a black soldier with no rank insignia, a sealed case nobody could open, and credentials that made the entire system flinch walked through the front gate. The military police detained him within minutes, stripped his weapon, walked him through the yard in front of everyone, and Captain Briggs, certain he'd caught a threat, locked him in a holding room and threw the full weight of base authority at a man who never once raised his voice. What nobody on that base understood yet, not Briggs, not the colonel, not a single soldier. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The Mojave heat was the kind that pressed down on everything, thick, relentless, without mercy. Iron Ridge Base sat in the middle of it all, a maze of concrete and steel baking under a white sky, surrounded by nothing but cracked earth and distant mountains that shimmered like a mirage. Somewhere behind the perimeter fence, generators hummed. Surveillance towers rotated in slow, mechanical arcs. And on a morning that looked like any other, a single military transport vehicle rolled through the outer gate and stopped 60 yards short of the main checkpoint. The man who stepped out was quiet in the way that certain men are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've learned that silence does more work than words in most rooms. Elijah Carter was in his early 30s, broad-shouldered, with a stillness in his face that made it hard to read him at a distance. He wore standard-issue desert fatigues, no rank insignia visible on his collar or sleeve, just the uniform, broken in from use, and a pair of boots that had clearly seen more than a training field. In his right hand, he carried a sealed black case, roughly the size of a large laptop bag, but noticeably heavier. The kind of case that didn't invite questions. He adjusted the strap once, scanned the checkpoint ahead with unhurried eyes, and walked forward. Iron Ridge was not a routine base on a routine day. Any soldier with half a set of working eyes could see that. The parking area near the command building held vehicles with multi-star plate markings, the kind that didn't appear unless something significant was happening behind closed doors. Personnel moved with that particular brand of urgency that isn't running but isn't walking either, that middle space between controlled and anxious. 2 additional MP units had been posted near the inner gate, which was unusual. Somewhere near the eastern hangar, a group of officers stood in a tight circle around a tablet, speaking in low voices. Elijah noted all of it without reacting to any of it. He reached the main checkpoint and set his case down at his side with the deliberate ease of someone who had done this 100 times before. The MP at the booth, a younger man, early 20s, name tape reading Fuller, looked up, reached for the standard ID scanner, and held it out with the practiced boredom of routine. Elijah placed his credentials against the scanner. The machine beeped. Then it beeped again, then a third time, and the light on top cycled from green to amber to red in the span of 3 seconds. Fuller frowned. He tapped the side of the scanner, the universal soldier method for fixing any piece of technology, and ran the credentials again. Same result. The small screen on the device populated with a line of text that Fuller stared at for a moment longer than he should have. Access restricted, level Omega. Fuller looked up from the screen. Then he looked at Elijah, then back at the screen. He set the scanner down slowly and reached for his radio. The next 4 minutes moved quickly. Sergeant Dale Cole arrived at the checkpoint with 2 additional MPs flanking him and the immediate energy of someone who had been waiting all morning for something to be wrong about. Cole was a compact man with wide shoulders and a jaw that seemed permanently set at an angle of confrontation. He'd been at Iron Ridge for 3 years, long enough to believe he understood the base better than most people who outranked him, and he wore that belief on his face every single day. He looked at Elijah. He looked at the scanner readout. He crossed his arms. "Step to the side," he said. "I'd like to contact command," Elijah said. His voice was level. No strain in it, no irritation. He might have been asking for directions. "You don't get to ask for command," Cole said. He took a step forward, closing the distance to about 2 feet, the kind of distance designed to make a person feel crowded. "You barely get to breathe here until we know what this," he gestured at the scanner, "is actually about. Step to the side." Elijah looked at him for a moment. Not with anger, with the particular patience of someone who already knows how this scene ends and is simply waiting for the other person to catch up. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. Cole's expression didn't change. "Step to the side, or I will put you to the side." Elijah stepped to the side. What happened next was the kind of thing that became a story people told in the mess hall for weeks afterward. Not because it was violent or dramatic, but because of how wrong it felt. Elijah was processed at the checkpoint like a threat. His sidearm was removed. His credentials were tagged and bagged. Two MPs flanked him on either side and walked him through the main gate, through the open yard, past the vehicle bay and the side entrance to the communications building, in full view of a dozen soldiers who stopped what they were doing to watch. The whispers started immediately. "What is that? Who is he? Did you see the case they took off him?" "Heard his ID flagged Omega clearance." "What's Omega clearance?" The black case was logged separately, handled with awkward caution by an MP who clearly wasn't sure whether to treat it like evidence or ordnance. It was sealed inside a secondary container and moved to the security storage room under 2 locks and Cole's personal authorization code. Through all of it, Elijah Carter said nothing. He walked where they walked him. He sat when they told him to sit. He placed his hands where they told him to place them. And he did all of this with the calm of a man who had already calculated every variable in the room and found none of them particularly concerning. Lieutenant Ava Reynolds was standing near the intel bay when they walked him through. She was 26, sharp-featured, with the kind of mind that didn't let inconsistencies lie flat. She'd been flagged twice in her career for asking questions that her superiors hadn't thought to ask yet, and she wore that distinction with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood it as a compliment, even when it wasn't meant as one. She watched Elijah cross the yard. She watched the MPs. She watched the way Cole carried himself, inflated, certain, and then she watched the man beside him, who looked like none of this was happening to him at all. Something didn't fit. She'd seen detainees before. She'd seen suspects, persons of interest, contractors pulled in for clearance issues. They all had something in common, a quality of disruption, of being caught off balance, of scrambling to explain themselves. The man they were walking through the yard right now had none of that. His shoulders were relaxed. His chin was level. His eyes moved around the base with the calm assessment of someone taking inventory, not someone panicking. She filed that away and went back to her workstation. Captain Daniel Briggs ran base security with the conviction that every problem was a nail and he was the only hammer on the property. He was 43, career military, with a record that looked excellent on paper and a style of command that worked well in situations requiring blunt force and poorly in situations requiring nuance. When Cole briefed him on the checkpoint incident, Briggs listened with his hands flat on his desk and his expression already decided. "Omega flag on a credential that has no file attached to it," Cole said. "No record in base personnel. No prior communication to command about an expected arrival. And he's carrying a case with a lock system our guys have never seen." "Where is he now?" "High security holding. Room 3. Briggs stood up. "Good. I'll handle it personally." The holding room was a gray box, concrete walls, 1 table, 2 chairs, a single overhead light that was slightly too bright. Elijah sat in the chair on the far side of the table with his hands resting loosely in front of him. He looked up when Briggs entered, but didn't straighten or shift. He simply watched. Briggs sat across from him, opened a folder that contained the log credentials and the scanner readout, and looked at Elijah for a long moment. "Let's start simple," Briggs said. "Who are you?" "I'd like to speak with your commanding officer," Elijah said. "That's not how this works." "Then I'll wait." Briggs leaned forward. "I've got a credential that flags Omega clearance, a lock case my guys can't open, and no record of you existing anywhere in our system. You understand how that looks?" "I understand exactly how it looks," Elijah said, "which is why I'm asking you to call your commanding officer. Not as a request, as advice." Briggs changed tack. He pushed the folder across the table, pointed to the scanner readout, and walked Elijah through what the Omega flag could mean: tampering, forgery, unauthorized access attempt. He spoke in the methodical cadence of a man who believed that volume and repetition were tools of persuasion. He escalated gradually. His voice rose. He mentioned federal charges. He mentioned black site transfers. He mentioned the word espionage twice, letting it sit in the room each time like he expected it to land hard. Elijah waited through all of it. When Briggs finished, Elijah said, "Call your commanding officer." Now, Briggs stood up from the table and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back. "You're going to be here a long time," he said. "You have less than an hour," Elijah replied, "before this becomes your problem." Briggs left. In the security storage room, two MPs were doing exactly what they'd been told not to do, attempting to open the black case. The first MP, a young specialist named Webb, had tried the standard bypass tools twice with no result. The case didn't have a visible keyhole or a standard combination interface. What it had was a recessed biometric panel in the upper right corner, flush with the surface, barely visible unless you knew where to look. When Webb pressed his thumb against it out of curiosity, the case didn't open. But something else happened. A small display panel along the side edge of the case, dark until that moment, lit up with a faint blue glow. Text appeared on it, visible for only a few seconds before the screen went dark again. Webb leaned in and read it before it disappeared. "Unauthorized access, attempt logged. Detention status confirmed." "What does that mean?" the second MP asked. Webb pulled his hand back. "I have no idea." Somewhere inside the case, something clicked, not loudly, but with the particular certainty of a mechanism engaging. Back in the Intel bay, Ava had stopped pretending she was doing her assigned work. She was running a clearance search on the credential ID that had been logged at the checkpoint, using the access level her rank allowed, and then carefully going one layer deeper using an authorization she technically had, but wasn't supposed to use casually. The search returned in under 30 seconds. No file found. She ran it again. Still nothing. She tried cross-referencing the credential string with personnel databases for each of the 5 branches. Nothing. She searched archived records. Nothing. She queried the classified contractor registry that she had to fill out a secondary authorization to access. Nothing. She sat back in her chair. In her experience, people got removed from systems. Records got classified, sealed, buried under layers of authorization requirements. But to not find even a shell, no redacted file, no placeholder entry, no access denied return that would at least confirm a file existed somewhere. That was different. A redacted file meant someone wanted you to know the file existed while keeping the contents from you. No file at all meant something else entirely. It meant the person in that holding room had been deliberately kept outside the architecture of the systems she was looking at. That thought didn't sit easily with her. She pulled up the base activity log for the morning and scrolled back through the checkpoint records. Elijah's arrival had been logged, but when she tried to pull the associated personnel profile that should have auto-populated, the field was blank. Not blank like empty. Blank like there had never been a hook to attach it to. She closed the window, opened it again, and found a fragment, a single encrypted reference, buried in a routing tag that had been attached to the checkpoint flag automatically by the system. The reference was a code string she didn't recognize. She ran it separately. The return was a single line. Phantom Division. Classification. Restricted. She stared at it for a moment. Then she wrote it down by hand on a notepad and closed the tab. In holding room 3, Elijah looked at the wall across from him. The overhead light hummed. Outside the door, he could hear the muffled movement of MPs, the occasional crackle of a radio. He had been in rooms like this before. Smaller ones. Colder ones. Rooms where the people asking the questions had considerably more leverage than Briggs did, and where the patience required to wait them out had been a matter of survival rather than strategy. This was not that. This was a misunderstanding of a magnitude that was, frankly, impressive, the kind that required a particular combination of arrogance and institutional blindness to manufacture. He wasn't angry. Anger was a cost he'd learned to stop paying for situations that didn't require it. He glanced at the clock on the wall. The second hand moved. He counted the intervals between the guard change outside the door. He listened to the distant sound of aircraft movement near the eastern runway. 2 fighter jets that had been cycling on the ground since he arrived, which told him the operational window for Black Veil was compressing faster than the timeline had allowed for. He let out a slow breath through his nose. "You have less than an hour," he had told Briggs. That was accurate at the time. He adjusted the estimate now, factoring in what he'd heard from the runway. 40 minutes. Maybe. He sat with that. In the operations center on the base's west side, a briefing was running for the 6 officers cleared for knowledge of Operation Black Veil. Colonel Raymond Harris, Iron Ridge's commanding officer, stood at the head of the table with a posture that communicated authority and a face that communicated stress. Harris was 51, silver-haired, with 28 years of command experience and an instinct for institutional politics that had gotten him to his current rank and occasionally gotten in his way there. He was gesturing at a map, a regional overview with 4 color markers representing covert team positions, when his aide leaned in and whispered something in his ear. Harris paused. His eyes moved slightly, but his expression didn't. "Continue," he told the briefing officer, and stepped out of the room. He returned 90 seconds later. The marker positions had changed in the interim, one of them drifting 20 kilometers east of its last confirmed location. Harris looked at it and said nothing. No one in the room knew about the man in holding room 3. Harris intended to keep it that way for now. 43 minutes after Elijah had been walked through the front gate, the first system fault appeared. It was small, a 30-second delay in the base's internal communication routing, the kind of thing that looked like a server hiccup. The tech on duty logged it as a minor anomaly and flagged it for the end-of-day report. 4 minutes later, a secondary fault appeared in the surveillance system. One camera sector, the block containing the security holding rooms, cycled through a 6-second loop before resetting. The tech duty officer frowned at his screen and reached for his radio. In holding room 3, Elijah looked at the clock. 38 minutes. He looked at the door. "You have less than an hour," he had said. The clock ticked. The second hour at Iron Ridge Base began with the specific kind of quiet that precedes something breaking. Briggs had returned to the holding room once since the first interrogation, this time with 2 MPs standing at the door and a printed sheet of what he described as confirmed inconsistencies in Elijah's situation. He'd gone through them with the satisfaction of a man building a case he believed in, pointing out the absence of records, the unrecognized clearance flag, the case that no one could open, the complete lack of prior communication to base command about any arriving personnel. Elijah had listened to all of it with his hands resting on the table and his eyes steady on Briggs. She pulled up the base communication log for the past 3 hours and ran a filter for any outbound traffic that had been flagged, delayed, or rerouted. The results came back with 4 entries, all within the last 90 minutes. Each one showed a routing tag that matched the Phantom Division string she'd written on her notepad. Someone had been monitoring this base's communications from the moment Elijah was detained. She picked up her notepad and walked toward the security section. The base system's fault that had started as a minor routing delay had, over the course of the second hour, grown into something that the tech duty team was no longer comfortable describing as minor. 3 separate communication channels had experienced lag. The surveillance grid covering the north perimeter had reset twice, and a secondary authentication protocol on the base's command network had activated without any logged trigger, meaning it had been activated from outside. The tech duty officer, a sharp and methodical warrant officer named Grayson, had escalated the issue twice already. The second escalation had reached Briggs, who had told him to document it and continue monitoring. Grayson was now on his 3rd escalation request and had begun composing a summary report with the particular precision of someone who wanted a clear record of what he'd flagged and when. The base's systems weren't failing. They were being watched. That distinction was important, and Grayson put it in the report. At the same moment, in the security storage room, the black case's side panel lit up again. This time it stayed lit. The display read, "Unauthorized detention confirmed. Protocol Delta active." The panel cycled once, and then a soft tone, barely audible like the frequency at the edge of hearing, began to pulse from somewhere inside the case at 10-second intervals. Webb, who was still in the room, looked at it and then looked at the door and made a decision that the room was no longer somewhere he wanted to be alone. He reported to Cole, who reported to Briggs, who stood in front of the case for 20 seconds without touching it. "Lock this room," Briggs said finally. "Double the post. Nobody touches it." He walked out. Ava found Briggs in the corridor outside the operations center and fell on his step beside him. "Captain, I need 60 seconds. I'm Busse Reynolds." "I know. That's why I'm asking for 60 seconds instead of 20 minutes. She kept her voice even. "I've been running clearance checks on the man you have in holding. There's no file, which you know, but the credential flag he triggered, Omega level. It's connected to a classification tier I've never seen before. And his detention has already generated 4 flag communication intercepts in our outbound traffic. This base is being monitored right now, in real time." Briggs stopped walking. He turned and looked at her. "Monitored how?" "Externally. Someone outside this base knew the moment he was detained. Probably before Grayson logged the system faults." She paused. "What if he's not lying?" Briggs's jaw tightened. "What if he is? Then we lose 60 seconds checking." She held his gaze. "What do we lose if he's not?" For a moment, a brief, honest moment, something moved behind Briggs's eyes. Then it closed. "He's in holding for good reason, Reynolds. I followed protocol. The system is flagging things that don't happen when you follow protocol," she said quietly. Briggs pointed down the corridor. "Back to your station. I'll handle this." She went, but she didn't go back to her station. She went to the server room. In holding room 3, Elijah had been sitting with his eyes closed for the past several minutes. Not sleeping. He didn't sleep in rooms like this. It was a discipline he'd built over years, the ability to rest within a narrow band of alertness, enough to restore something without losing the thread of attention. When the door opened and Briggs came in alone this time, without the MPs, without the folder, Elijah opened his eyes and waited. Briggs sat down across from him. He didn't open with accusations this time. "You referenced an operation," Briggs said. "Something with a 24-hour window. How did you know about that?" Elijah looked at him steadily. "Because I'm the reason it exists." "Explain that." "Not to you." He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it land harder. "I've been here for over an hour. The window I was working with when I arrived has compressed by approximately a third. The systems on your base are already showing the effects of a protocol I didn't activate. It activated on its own when your staff tried to open my case. You have a classified operation running that most of the people on this base don't know is live. And you are spending your time in this room." He paused. "Call your commanding officer. That's the last time I'll say it." Briggs leaned back. He was working through something. Ava's words, the system reports, the side panel on the case, and now this man sitting across from him with no visible anxiety about any of it. "You're not going to tell me anything else," Briggs said. It wasn't quite a question. "You're not equipped to run what's coming," Elijah said. "That's not an insult. It's a classification issue. The people who need to be in this conversation aren't in this room." Briggs stood. He left without saying anything. The server room was cold and smelled like electronics and recycled air. Ava worked quickly, pulling logs with the focused efficiency of someone who understood that every minute she spent on this carried a professional risk she decided was worth taking. She went back through the system fault timeline, the routing delays, the surveillance resets, the external authentication trigger, and mapped them against the timeline of Elijah's detention. Everything had started within 7 minutes of him being walked through the gate. She pulled the outbound communication intercepts and looked at the routing signatures again. The external monitoring wasn't passive. It was structured, organized, operating from a known channel that the base's communication system recognized, even if the security team didn't. The flag it was sending back wasn't a hack or an intrusion. It was an authorized override code being held in a dormant state, waiting for activation conditions to be met. Detention of a specific credential type had been the trigger. She leaned against the server rack and thought about that. The system hadn't been compromised. The system had been designed by someone, somewhere, who had anticipated exactly this scenario and built a response into the architecture of the base's own infrastructure. Without the base knowing, that level of access didn't come from a contractor or a field officer. She looked at her notepad. Phantom Division. She thought about the man in the holding room. The composure, the patience, the way he had told Briggs, "You're making a mistake," without a single degree of urgency in his voice. Not the effect of a man bluffing. The effect of a man who already knew the outcome and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up to it. Her radio crackled. Grayson's voice. Reynolds, you near terminal? Base comms just flagged a new fault. It's not a delay this time. Something's trying to route through. She looked at the screen in front of her. The base communication system was blinking an incoming connection, external origin, using the same channel as the monitoring signatures. Then it cut off. Silence on the line. Then, slowly, across every screen in the server room, and, she would later learn, every screen in the operations center and the command building simultaneously, a single line of text appeared. Command override initiated. Standby. She stared at it. In holding room 3, Elijah Carter looked at the clock on the wall, then at the door. 30 minutes, he said to no one. The text on every screen held for 5 seconds. Then it disappeared. But every door lock on the security wing engaged at the same moment, and the sound of them clicking shut, one after another, in sequence, moved through the corridor like a row of dominoes falling, mechanical and inevitable, until the whole section sealed itself, and the lights shifted to the flat amber of emergency secondary power. The base's main communication array went silent, and somewhere above the desert, invisible against the hard blue of the afternoon sky, a satellite adjusted its orientation by a fraction of a degree and began transmitting on a frequency that none of the equipment at Iron Ridge was supposed to be able to receive. Across 6 global command nodes, the same alert populated simultaneously on classified terminals. Asset Carter, status, detained. Protocol Delta, active. Override window, open. No one at Iron Ridge knew any of this, but they were about to. The amber emergency lighting did something to people that standard overhead fluorescence never did. It flattened faces, shortened shadows, and made everyone look like they were standing inside a problem they didn't know how to name. That was the quality of light in the Iron Ridge Command Building when the door locks engaged across the security wing and the main communication array went quiet. And it was the quality of light that Colonel Raymond Harris was standing under when his aide handed him a printed fault report that was already 3 pages long and growing. Harris read the first page, then the second. Then he set the report down on his desk with the particular care of someone placing something fragile on a surface they weren't sure would hold. "What do you mean the communication array is silent?" he said. "Outbound is completely blocked, sir. Inbound is routing through a channel we don't control. Tech team has been on it for 11 minutes, and they cannot identify the source of the override. Grayson, he's in the server room. He says it's not a hack. He says it looks like the system is, his word, cooperating with it." Harris stood very still for a moment. Outside his window, through the narrow glass that looked out over the central yard, he could see 2 MPs standing near the security wing entrance looking at each other with the expression of men who had been told to guard something and were now watching that thing become substantially more complicated than guarding. "Where is Briggs?" Harris said. "Heading here, sir." "And the detainee?" "Still in holding room 3. The lock engaged like everything else. He's not going anywhere." Harris turned from the window. "Give me a hard line to the eastern relay. If main comms are locked, we route through the relay." "We tried that, sir. The relay is routing through the same external channel." Harris picked up the fault report again. He turned to page 3. There was a line near the bottom that Grayson had written in plain language rather than technical notation, which meant Grayson had wanted to make sure it was understood clearly. Override source authenticated. Not external intrusion. Internal architecture responding to pre-coded trigger condition. This was built into the system. Harris set the report down again. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then, "Get Briggs in here. Now." Briggs arrived in the command office 2 minutes later with the energy of a man who had been moving fast and was not going to show that he was rattled by it. He gave Harris a summary. The detention, the credential flag, the case, the interrogation sessions, the system faults, in the clip cadence of someone presenting facts they believed supported their decisions. Harris listened without interrupting. When Briggs finished, Harris said, "You ran 2 interrogation sessions on an Omega flag credential with no file and no command confirmation. Protocol requires you to escalate a credential flag above your clearance tier to command. Immediately." Harris's voice was measured but not warm. "You didn't escalate. You interrogated." Briggs's jaw moved. The flag indicated a potential security threat. With Black Veil active, I wasn't going to... You weren't going to what, Briggs? Thing. Harris turned back to the window. Now, I have a base with sealed doors and a communication array that doesn't belong to me anymore. And I have a man in holding room 3 who told you, twice, according to Cole's log, to call command. The silence in the room had weight to it. What do you want me to do, sir? Briggs said. Stand in that corner and don't touch anything, Harris said. It wasn't a joke. Ava was still in the server room when the locks engaged, and being in the server room when the locks engaged turned out to be the best possible place to be, because the server room had a hardwired terminal that was connected to a secondary network layer that the override hadn't fully subsumed yet. A legacy system, older than most of the base's current infrastructure, that was still accessible if you knew where to find it. Ava found it. She worked quickly and quietly, cross-referencing everything she'd gathered in the last hour against the new fault data that Grayson had been compiling. The picture it assembled was not comfortable. The base's systems hadn't been attacked. They had been placed in a holding pattern, a deliberate, structured pause that restricted outbound communication and internal movement without disabling essential functions. Power was fine. Life safety systems were fine. What was restricted was specifically and precisely the base's ability to act independently, to communicate outside, and to move personnel through secured areas. It was surgical, it was controlled, and it had been triggered by the detention of one man. She pulled the legacy terminal's log of inbound traffic on the external monitoring channel and ran it backward from the current timestamp. The monitoring had been active since 11 minutes after Elijah had been walked through the gate. It had been passive until the case's side panel was touched by the MP in the storage room. That event had escalated it from monitoring to Protocol Delta active status. And Protocol Delta, based on what she could read in the architecture, was designed to do exactly one thing: hold a situation in place while a higher authority prepared to intervene. She wrote that down. Then she made a decision that she understood could end her career or accelerate it, depending entirely on whether her read of the situation was correct. She left the server room, walked to the security wing, and used her authorization code on the door panel. The door didn't open. The lock override controlled it. But the panel registered her code and logged it, which meant Grayson's secondary system would see that she'd tried. She knocked. From the other side of the sealed door, she heard nothing for a moment. Then Elijah's voice, calm and clear, came through the ventilation gap at the base of the door. Lieutenant Reynolds. She went still. He knew her name. He knew her rank. He had been in that room for 2 hours with no access to personnel files or internal systems, and he knew her name and rank. Yes, she said. The door won't open from your code right now. The override controls physical access in this section. A brief pause. You've been running the external monitoring channel logs. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said again. What did you find? She looked down the corridor both ways. Empty. Protocol Delta is a containment hold. Not hostile. Designed to freeze a situation for intervention. It was triggered by the case. Correct. The Phantom Division reference. It's above Joint Chiefs level. Also correct. She pressed her hand flat against the door. Who are you? A pause. Longer this time. Someone who was sent here to do a job, Elijah said, and who needs the door open to do it. I can't open it from here. The override goes to Grayson's secondary terminal, the legacy system. You were just there. She turned around and walked back toward the server room at a pace that was not quite a run. Harris was still in his office when the secure phone on his desk rang. Not the standard line, the secure line, the one with the red handset that sat in a locked cradle and was tested quarterly and almost never used. He looked at it for one full ring. Then he picked it up. The voice on the other end was measured and unhurried, the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to carefully. Colonel Harris, release your detainee immediately. Harris straightened. Identify yourself. You don't have clearance for that information over this channel. Release the detainee. I have a man in holding with an unverified credential, no personnel file, and a device that has locked down half my base. I need identification before I act on any order. A brief silence. You have a man in holding, the voice said, who was due at Iron Ridge 6 hours ago for operational command of an active classified mission. Your security team's decision to detain him has created a command gap in that mission. I'm asking you one time, Colonel. Release him. Harris gripped the handset. I need verification of authority before. The line disconnected. Harris set the handset down. He stood there for a moment with his hand still on it. Briggs, from the corner of the room where he'd been standing in strained silence, said, "Who was that?" "I don't know," Harris said. That was the problem. In the server room, Ava found the legacy terminal still live and navigated to the access override panel that Grayson had locked behind a secondary authorization. She used her code. It accepted. She went into the physical access controls for the security wing and found the holding room locks listed individually. Room 3 was flagged with the protocol Delta override, which meant her standard authorization wouldn't release it. But there was a second option, a manual exception protocol for medical or life safety emergencies that bypassed the override lock and logged a justification code. She stared at it for a moment. Using it would generate a record. The record would be reviewed. She would have to explain it. She entered the justification code for medical assessment, technically within her authority as a senior officer, technically stretching the definition of the situation, and authorized the release. Down the corridor, she heard the lock on holding room 3 disengage. She was at the door 30 seconds later. Elijah was already standing when she opened it, the composed, unhurried posture of someone who had expected the door to open at approximately that moment. He looked at her directly. "Good call on a legacy terminal," he said. "You knew about it. I know about most things on this base." She stepped back. He walked out into the corridor, and she fell in a step beside him. "You said you compromised a mission. Tell me what that means." "Walk and talk," he said. "We don't have much time." As they moved through the corridor, he spoke in the efficient cadence of someone relaying a briefing to someone he decided, in the span of about 90 seconds, was capable of receiving it. Black Veil was live. Multiple covert teams across 3 international zones. The command architecture for the operation ran through a single field commander. Him, because the operation sensitivity meant that standard chain-of-command structures would create paper trails that several governments had agreed couldn't exist. The 47-minute command gap created by his detention had pushed one team off script. A target had moved. The operational window was compressing. "What's the case?" she asked. "Command interface. Everything runs through it." "Where is it?" "Security storage. Room 7, second lock." She changed direction. He followed without comment. They were 30 feet from the security storage room when the base erupted. Not with sound. There was no explosion, no alarm, no single dramatic noise. It was more like a pressure change, the kind you feel in the air before something breaks. 3 things happened in rapid succession. Every screen on the base's internal network populated simultaneously with a standby signal. A fighter jet on the eastern runway powered up its engines without a scramble order being issued, and Colonel Harris's office phone rang again, this time on every line at once. Ava stopped in the corridor. Elijah did not stop. "Keep moving," he said. She caught up. They reached security storage, and she used the same medical exception authorization to release the lock. The room was empty. Webb had cleared out after the case's panel activated, and no one had been back. The black case sat on the center table exactly as it had been placed, sealed, the biometric panel dark. Elijah crossed to it, pressed his thumb against the panel, and the case opened with a solid, mechanical release of pressure. Inside, in fitted compartments, 2 encrypted tablets, a compact satellite transceiver, a command interface unit that looked like nothing available through standard military procurement, and a set of earpieces. He took one of the tablets and the transceiver. He handed Ava an earpiece. "Put it in," he said. "You're going to want to hear what happens next." She put it in. He activated the transceiver. Across the base, in every room with a screen, the operations center, the command building, the communications hub, the briefing rooms, the security monitoring station, the standby signal that had populated on the internal network was replaced simultaneously with a live feed. The feed showed a secure conference room. The background was generic, gray wall, overhead light, the kind of deliberately anonymous setting that existed in certain facilities for exactly this kind of communication. But the people in the frame were not anonymous. Seated at the table were 4 individuals in uniform. Three of them wore the kind of rank insignia that most Iron Ridge personnel had only seen in photographs. The fourth, centered in the frame and looking directly into the camera, was a four-star general. His name was known. His face was known. He was not someone who appeared on base screens unannounced. Beside him, partially visible, were two individuals in civilian dress whose presence alongside a four-star general communicated, without any words being spoken, that this was not a unilateral military matter. Every person at Iron Ridge who was near a screen stopped moving. In the operations center, a junior officer who had been in the middle of a sentence simply stopped speaking. At the communications hub, Grayson set down the diagnostic tool he'd been holding and looked at the screen on the wall with the expression of someone recalibrating everything they understood about their afternoon. In the command building, Harris stood in front of his office screen with his hands at his sides and his face doing something complicated. Briggs, standing 6 feet behind Harris, went very still. The general looked into the camera. When he spoke, his voice came through every speaker on the base at the same volume. Not loud, not aggressive, but with the particular quality of authority that doesn't need to be loud. "Iron Ridge Base," the general said. "Stand down immediately." The words landed in the silence of the base like something being placed on a table rather than thrown at it. Clean. Final. With no ambiguity about what they meant. Harris moved first. He took a step toward his screen, and when he spoke, his voice was controlled but carried an edge of a man who did not want to capitulate without understanding what he was capitulating to. "General, this base is in the middle of a security situation. We have a detained individual whose credentials. You have detained a protected asset," the general said. His tone didn't change. "That is the security situation." Harris opened his mouth, closed it. Briggs, from behind him, said, "With respect, sir, we have a man with no verifiable file and an unregistered." "Captain." The general's gaze moved in the feed, a fractional shift that communicated he was aware of exactly who was speaking. "You are not in this conversation." Briggs closed his mouth. In a security storage room, Elijah was monitoring the feed on the tablet. Ava watched his face. He was not smiling, it wasn't that. But there was something in the set of his features that she would later try to describe to herself and settle on as recognition. Not surprise. He had been waiting for exactly this. The general looked directly into the camera, and his voice shifted by a degree. Not softer, but more specific. "Apologies for the delay, Commander." Every person watching who heard that word, Commander, felt the shift. Because a four-star general did not use that form of address to anyone beneath a certain level of authority, and no one in that feed was being addressed except for the man who was not on screen. In the operations center, two officers exchanged a look that contained, without words, the entire rapid reassessment of everything that had happened since morning. In the command building, Harris turned slowly from the screen and looked at Briggs. Briggs looked back at him with the expression of a man who has just understood, very clearly, the shape of the mistake he has made. Elijah moved. He walked out of the security storage room with the case closed and held it aside, and Ava one step behind him. They came through the security wing door, which opened cleanly now, the protocol Delta hold released by the general's command authentication, and into the corridor that led to the main operations section. Harris met him there. The colonel was a tall man with 28 years of command authority written into his posture, and he stood in the corridor with that authority intact because it was structural to who he was, and he didn't know how to put it down. But something had changed behind his eyes. The man in front of him had just been addressed as commander by a four-star general on a live feed that every person on the base had watched. That was not a piece of information Harris could process and then set aside. "You will explain yourself," Harris said. His voice was composed. The stiffness of it was the only sign of the effort that composure was costing him. Elijah looked at him for a moment. "You'll listen first," he said. He walked past Harris without slowing. Harris stood in the corridor for a moment, and then, because there was nothing else to do that was consistent with any version of professional functioning, he turned and followed. The operations center cleared at Elijah's unspoken instruction. Personnel peeled away from workstations and moved to the edges of the room or out into the corridor entirely, the way people move when they suddenly understand that a space is no longer theirs. Ava took a station near the primary terminal. Elijah set the case on the central table, opened it, and connected the command interface unit to the base's main system. The screens that had been showing the general's feed shifted. New data populated, a live operational map, position markers, encrypted communication threads, a running timeline with a window marked in red. The general was still on one of the secondary screens. The window is at 31 minutes, the general said. The team that went off script is currently dark. Last known position puts them 2 kilometers east of the secondary extraction point. I see them, Elijah said, studying the map. They haven't been compromised. They've gone aground. He pointed at a cluster of terrain markers. Here, elevated cover, defensible perimeter. They're waiting. Waiting for what? For me to come back online. He pulled up the communication thread, which I'm doing now. Harris had come into the room and positioned himself near the doorway. He was watching Elijah operate with the expression of a man doing a rapid and humbling recalculation. Briggs stood 3 feet behind him, slightly back, with the look of someone who would very much like to be in a different building. Elijah looked up from the interface and scanned the room. His eyes settled on Briggs for a moment, not with anger, not with the desire to humiliate. Something more clinical. Security logs, he said. Pull every communication attempt made through the base's main array between 0800 and 1100 hours. Briggs looked at Harris. Harris gave a small nod. Briggs moved to a terminal. Ava was already working. She'd anticipated the request and had the log filtered and displayed before Briggs finished sitting down. Elijah crossed her station, looked at the screen, and moved through the entries with the practiced speed of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. He found it in under a minute. 3 incoming communication attempts on the base's primary secure channel, all originating from authenticated command sources, all blocked at the routing level. Timestamps: 0823, 0847, 0911. All 3 fell within the window of Elijah's detention. He looked at Briggs. These are external command signals, he said. Authenticated. They were blocked before they reached command. Briggs stiffened. I didn't block anything. The system flagged the override. The system flagged Protocol Delta, which should have escalated those signals to command level automatically. They were intercepted before escalation. Elijah's voice was level. That's not Protocol Delta. That's manual routing interference. The room went quiet in a different way than it had gone quiet before. Before, it had been the silence of people waiting to see what would happen. Now it was the silence of people watching something happen and understanding that it was going to have consequences that none of them were fully ready for. Harris turned from the doorway and looked at the communication log on the screen. His face did something brief and difficult to read. Not quite guilt, not quite fear, but something in the territory between them that only appears when a person recognizes that a thing they believed was contained is no longer contained. Elijah saw it. He didn't say anything about it. Not yet. He filed it, the way he had filed every piece of information since he had arrived at this base, and turned back to the operational map. The window is at 28 minutes, the general said from the secondary screen. Elijah straightened. He looked at the map. He looked at Ava. You're good with communication architecture, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she said. Give me a clean line to the dark team. Route it through the transceiver in the case. Don't use base comms, they're compromised. She moved. Elijah turned to face the room. The officers and personnel who remained, the ones who had stayed because their functions were relevant and because leaving felt worse than staying, looked at him with the particular attention of people who have just watched the entire authority structure of their environment reorganize itself around a single point. He looked back at them with the calm of someone who has stood at the center of exactly this kind of moment before and found it neither surprising nor uncomfortable. You don't have a detainee problem anymore, he said. You have a war problem. No one spoke. He turned back to the interface. The operational map pulsed. The timeline window ticked down. Somewhere in a terrain-locked position 2 kilometers east of an extraction point that no one in this room had known existed an hour ago, a team was waiting for a signal that was, at last, on its way. Harris stood in the doorway of his own operations center, in his own base, on his own command, and watched a man he had locked in a holding room 4 hours ago run the most classified operation he had ever been adjacent to, and understood, with the quiet and total clarity that only comes after the fact, that every decision made since morning had been wrong. Briggs stood behind him and understood the same thing, but with the additional weight of knowing he had been the one making most of those decisions. Ava worked at the terminal and understood something different, that she was watching a form of command she had never seen before, and that it was the most precise and controlled thing she had witnessed in 4 years of military service. And Elijah Carter, who had arrived at Iron Ridge Base that morning in standard fatigues with no rank insignia and a sealed black case, stood at the center of all of it and simply worked, because the mission had never stopped for him, not for a single minute, not even in the holding room. It had only been paused. Now it was running again. The operations center had the particular quality of a room that had recently been through something and hadn't fully processed it yet. Screens glowed with live data. Personnel moved with the careful, deliberate energy of people who had learned in the last 30 minutes that their instincts about the situation had been wrong and were now compensating by being very precise about everything. The air smelled like recycled coal and a faint metallic undertone of equipment running hard. Elijah stood at the central table with the command interface open and the operational map filling the primary screen. No one had told the remaining personnel to stay. No one had told them to go. They had made their own calculations, and most of them had stayed, which told him something useful about the composition of this particular base. Colonel Harris had moved from the doorway into the room proper. He stood near the far wall with his arms at his sides, and the effort of that posture, straight, composed, command-ready, was visible in the tension across his shoulders. He was a man trying to occupy space in a room that no longer belonged to him in the way it had 3 hours ago, and he was doing it with enough discipline that Elijah could almost respect the attempt. Almost. "You will explain the full scope of this operation," Harris said. His voice had the texture of someone who understood he was no longer giving orders, but had not yet found the vocabulary for what he was doing instead. Elijah looked up from the interface. "You'll listen first," he said. "Then I'll answer the questions that are relevant." Harris's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Elijah turned to the primary screen and pulled up the operational map at full display. A live, classified view that populated with the kind of detail that made 2 of the officers near the back wall exchange a glance, because the resolution and the real-time accuracy of what they were looking at was not something available through standard military intelligence channels. Multiple international zones glowed with color-coded markers, covert unit positions, extraction corridors, timing windows displayed in real-time countdowns. Black Veil, Elijah said, is a multi-nation covert extraction mission. It involves coordinated units across 3 international zones operating under agreements that exist outside standard treaty frameworks. None of it is officially documented. None of it will be, regardless of outcome. He moved through the map with a finger, tracing corridors and positions. The mission's command architecture is designed around a single operational hub. This interface, because distributed command on an operation this sensitive creates paper trails that the involved governments have agreed cannot exist. That means the entire mission runs through one person. He didn't gesture at himself. He didn't need to. Ava was at her terminal, cross-referencing the position data on her screen with the map, and she noted the way the room absorbed that information. Not with shock, exactly, but with the gradual, uncomfortable adjustment of people recalibrating the scale of what they were standing in the middle of. The operation has a single critical variable, Elijah continued. A defector. High value. The kind of high value that doesn't get quantified in personnel terms. He brought up a secondary overlay on the map. A separate marker, different color, with a status tag that currently read, position uncertain. This individual has access to nuclear authorization codes for a weapons system that belongs, officially, to no nation currently recognized in any arms treaty. Unofficially, he paused for a fraction of a second. It belongs to 3. The room was completely still. If this defector is taken by hostile forces before extraction is complete, Elijah said, the codes move with them. And the parties who want those codes are not interested in negotiation. Harris looked at the map. Something in his face had changed. The stiffness was still there, but underneath it, something that looked like it might eventually become the recognition of magnitude. Not guilt, not yet, but scale. How long has this been active? Harris said, 72 hours from initial deployment. Elijah looked at him directly. I was due on this base 6 hours before I arrived. The delay was operational, unavoidable. My arrival window was tight. It became tighter when your checkpoint detained me, and it became critical when the command gap hit 47 minutes. He paused. 47 minutes is a long time when a team is waiting for direction in a contested zone. What happened in those 47 minutes? Ava asked from her terminal, not looking up. A strike team went off script. They had a decision point they weren't cleared to make independently, and without command contact, they made it anyway. The target moved. He brought up a position log. The defector is no longer at the primary extraction point. Current location is tracked but unstable. We have a window. It's closing. He looked at the countdown on the map. 24 minutes. We move now, he said. Ava had been working the communication thread for the Dark Team since Elijah had asked her to, routing it through the transceiver rather than base comms, and she had it live in under 4 minutes, a clean, encrypted line that came up on the command interface with a green status indicator. She brought it up without announcing it, and simply turned her screen toward Elijah. He looked at it. He looked at her. Good, he said. It was 2 syllables. It landed like something more. She turned back to her terminal and kept working, pulling satellite imagery of the terrain around the defector's last confirmed position, layering it against topographical data and known hostile movement patterns from the mission's intelligence package. She wasn't doing this, Elijah noticed. He came to her station, looked at what she'd built, and said, "Mark the elevated approach from the northeast. That's the entry corridor if the primary is blocked." She marked it. He moved back to the interface. The dynamic that had formed between them over the past 20 minutes was not something either of them had announced or agreed to. It had simply emerged from the logic of the situation. She was fast, precise, and not waiting to be told what to do, which meant she was useful in the specific way that this moment required. He had adjusted accordingly, including her in the operational flow with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who makes personnel assessments quickly and acts on them without ceremony. It was not lost on the senior officers watching from across the room that a first lieutenant, who had spent the morning running unauthorized database queries, was now functionally running operational support for the most classified mission any of them had ever been adjacent to. Briggs, watching from near the door, said nothing. He had been saying nothing for a while now, and the nothing had a quality to it. Not sullen, not absent. Processing. Elijah pulled up the security logs on the secondary screen. He moved through them with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything. And when he found what he was looking for, he brought it to the primary display, without preamble. The 3 blocked communication signals from a morning. 0823, 0847, 0911. He turned to the room. These are authenticated external command signals. They arrived through the base's primary secure channel during the window of my detention. He brought up the routing architecture. Protocol Delta, once active, should have automatically escalated all authenticated external signals to command level. That's what it's designed to do. These 3 signals were intercepted before escalation. He let that sit for a moment. That interception required manual access to the base's communication routing at an administrative level. He looked at Briggs. Briggs looked back at him, and the expression on his face was one of a man who had been expecting this, dreading it, maybe, but expecting it, and who now understood that it was here. "I need to be clear," Elijah said. "These signals were not blocked by Protocol Delta. They were not blocked by your checkpoint procedures. They were not blocked by any automated system." Another pause. "They were manually rerouted." "I didn't block anything," Briggs said. His voice was flat, not defensive, something closer to exhausted. "I locked down the detainee area." She didn't say anything. Elijah had given assignments without asking for them to be accepted. He had told a signals officer named Hartwell to run continuous position updates on the defector's tracker. He had told a logistics officer to have a stealth transport ready at the eastern runway within 40 minutes. He had told Ava to maintain the clean communication line to the dark team and flag any position changes in real time. All three had done exactly what he said without hesitation, which was the particular quality of authority that didn't come from rank insignia or institutional position. It came from the clarity and precision of the person giving the instruction, and from the demonstrated fact that the person giving the instruction knew exactly what they were doing. Briggs had been given nothing. He sat near the back of the room and watched. 20 minutes into the reorganized operation, Ava flagged him. "There's something in the data logs," she said. She didn't raise her voice. The mode of Elijah had already confirmed in the corridor. The scale of it was larger than he'd initially read. He filed it. He would deal with the full scope of it after the mission. Right now, the mission had a problem that was more immediate than Harris. His earpiece activated. The voice on the clean line to the dark team was controlled, but carrying the specific compression of a person transmitting from a position that had become less secure since the last contact. "Command, this is Dark Element. Position updated. We are at secondary fallback. Threat presence has increased. Estimate 6 to 8 additional hostiles in the outer perimeter. We are still holding but a pause." A sound in the background that resolved into something that was not ambient noise. "We have movement on the eastern approach." Elijah pressed the earpiece. "Hold position. Extraction window is 22 minutes. Do not engage unless contact is unavoidable." "Copy. Holding." He looked at the operational map. The defector's position tracker had shifted a small movement northeast, which matched the dark team's secondary fallback location. They were together, which was good. The increased hostile presence around their perimeter was not good. He turned to Ava. "Satellite pass over the secondary fallback zone." Right now, she had it up in 40 seconds, a live overhead view of the terrain, the resolution sharp enough to show movement. The dark team's position was visible as a cluster of heat signatures in an elevated rock formation. The outer perimeter showed additional signatures, moving in a loose arc from the east. 6 confirmed, Avis said. 2 more possible western approach. Moving to cut off the extraction corridor, Elijah said. He studied the image for a moment. "They're not advancing. They're positioning. They're going to wait for the window to close," Avis said quietly. "Yes." He looked at the countdown. 19 minutes, which means we don't wait for the window. He opened the mission deployment parameters on the command interface and began building a revised extraction plan, a direct insertion to the northeast approach she'd marked earlier. Time to arrive at the fallback position with a 15-minute overlap before the hostile perimeter could complete its arc. It was tight. It was the kind of tight that left no room for the next problem, and there was always a next problem. "I need the stealth transport ready in 15 minutes, not 40, he said in no one specific. The logistics officer, whose name was Pruitt, said, "I'll get it done," and left the room at a pace that was almost a run. Harris, from the secondary terminal, said, "What do you need from me?" Elijah looked at him. The question was direct, and it carried in it the specific weight of a person who has understood what they did wrong and is now trying, in the only way available to them, to do something right. "Run interference on the airspace clearance for the stealth transport," Elijah said. "You have relationships with the regional air command that I don't, and I need that corridor open in 12 minutes. Harris nodded and moved to the terminal. It was not forgiveness. It was function. Elijah understood the difference, and so did Harris, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Ava had her eyes on the satellite feed and her hand near the communication line when the dark team's transmission broke up. It wasn't static. It was the specific pattern of a signal that had been interrupted by something physical, a transmission cut, not a technical fault. It lasted 4 seconds, came back, and the voice on the other end was different. Tighter. Command. Contact. Eastern approach. They moved early. Elijah was at the interface in 2 steps. How many? 3 confirmed, 2 suppressed. We are still holding the position. Defector is secure. A pause. The sound of movement, deliberate and low. We need extraction now. 14 minutes, Elijah said. We may not have 14. Elijah looked at the satellite feed over Ava's shoulder. The hostile signatures on the eastern approach had broken from their holding positions. 3 of them moving toward the rock formation, the others maintaining the outer arc. The dark team had taken them down to 5 active threats on the eastern side, but the western approach signatures were still in position and still moving. He calculated. He calculated the way he had learned to calculate in rooms considerably more dangerous than this one. Quickly, without the kind of hope that distorts math. "Ava," he said. "I see it," she said. She already had the northeast approach corridor up on a separate screen. If the transport hits the insertion point at the 12-minute mark instead of 15, the team can move to meet it. Cuts the exposure window. Can Pruitt make 12 minutes? She looked at her screen. "Hartwell, get Pruitt on the line." Hartwell patched it. Pruitt's voice came through, slightly breathless. "I'm on the runway. Crew is boarding. What do I need?" 12 minutes, not 15, Ava said. A pause. "I need 11 to do 12 right." "Then do 11, Elijah said. "Copy," Pruitt said, and the line went quiet. Ava turned to look at Elijah. She had the specific expression of someone who has been operating on instinct and professionalism for the past 2 hours and is only now, in a moment of slightly less immediate pressure, registering what that experience has felt like. Not overwhelmed. Something closer to the opposite. A kind of clarity that comes from finding out what you're capable of under conditions that don't allow for the question to be avoided. "The defector," she said. "Nuclear codes. 3 nations. If we lose them, we won't," Elijah said. "How do you know?" He looked at her for a moment. "Because we haven't yet," he said. "And I don't lose things I'm responsible for." It was not a boast. It was the specific, quiet statement of a person who has built their entire operating identity around a single principle and has never, in all the years of carrying it, given a reason to doubt itself. Ava heard that in it and said nothing more. From the back of the room, where Briggs had been sitting in his extended and deliberate silence, there was movement. He stood up from his chair and walked to his secondary terminal and pulled up the base's security perimeter protocols. He began running a sweep of all outbound vehicle and personnel activity, checking for any bayside anomalies that might compromise the transport deployment. Nobody had asked him to. He did it because it was useful and because it was the only thing he could do right now that was useful, and he understood clearly enough at this point that useful was the only currency that mattered. Elijah noticed. He didn't say anything. He turned back to the operational map. 13 minutes had become 11. 11 was what they had. 11 was what they would work with. The countdown ran. The transport powered up on the eastern runway. And somewhere in a rock formation in a contested zone that didn't officially exist, a team held a position around a person carrying information that 3 nations were willing to start a war over and waited for the signal that told them help was 11 minutes out. Elijah watched the map. He watched the hostile signatures. He watched the countdown. He breathed slowly and steadily, the way he had learned to breathe in rooms considerably smaller than this, in situations considerably less recoverable than this, when the only thing between a mission and its failure had been the specific, disciplined refusal to let urgency become panic. "Now we're out of time," he said quietly. He picked up the command interface. He began to move. The eastern runway at Iron Ridge smelled like jet fuel and hot asphalt, the kind of combination that meant something was about to move fast. The stealth transport sat on the tarmac with its engines already cycling, low and steady. Pruitt's crew running final checks with the focused efficiency of people who had been given 11 minutes and had decided 9 was better. The desert evening was pressing in from the west. The sky had gone from white to the deep, bruised orange of late afternoon, and the mountains in the distance had lost their shimmer and taken on their solid, indifferent shapes. Elijah walked across the tarmac with the black case sealed and strapped to his back, the command interface tablet secured inside his vest, and the earpiece running a live feed from Hartwell's position updates back in the operations center. Behind him, from members of a rapid response unit that had been standing by since morning fell into formation without being told to, they had received their briefing in 90 seconds, which was all the briefing they were going to get, and they had the quality of soldiers who understood that 90 seconds from this particular person was more information than 2 hours from most. Ava was beside him. She had not asked to come. She had not made a case or requested permission. She had simply appeared at the runway in field gear, boots, vest, sidearm, and fallen to step at his left side with the matter-of-fact composure of someone who has made a decision and finished making it. Elijah had looked at her for a single moment when she appeared. He had calculated something behind his eyes. Then he kept walking, which was the only answer she needed. Against protocol. Technically. Against the expectations of every senior officer who had watched her operate from behind a terminal for the past several hours. Not against logic. She had identified the northeast approach corridor that had become the mission's only viable insertion route. She had built the satellite overlay that the extraction plan now depended on. She understood the operational picture better than anyone on the transport except Elijah, and he was going to need someone who understood the operational picture in the field, not back at a terminal. She knew this. He knew this. They boarded the transport without discussing it. Harris stood at the edge of the runway and watched them go. He had cleared the airspace corridor in 10 minutes, 2 minutes faster than asked, using relationships with Regional Air Command that had taken years to build and that he had spent this evening. It was the most useful thing he had done all day, and it was not enough, and he knew that. And he stood there with that knowledge and watched the transport lift. Briggs stood 10 feet behind him. He watched too. When the transport cleared the perimeter fence and banked northeast against the darkening sky, he turned and went back inside. He had a security sweep to finish. The flight was 23 minutes. Elijah spent the first 8 on the command interface, monitoring the dark team's position and the hostile perimeter. The eastern threat had stabilized. The 3 hostiles the dark team had engaged were down, but the western approach signatures had completed their arc and were now positioned between the fallback point and the primary extraction corridor, which was why they were using the northeast approach, which was why the timing had to be exact. Ava was running the satellite feed on a secondary tablet, watching the overhead view update in real time as the transport moved. At the 14-minute mark, she said, "Western approach is moving again. They've got the primary corridor locked. They don't know about the northeast. That's the only thing working in our favor right now," Elijah said. "How many variables do you usually have working in your favor?" He looked up from the interface. A brief pause. "Enough," he said. She looked at the satellite feed. "The hostile count on the western approach is up to 9. That's more than the earlier estimate. I saw it. The team at the fallback is 4 people plus the defector. If the northeast insertion gets compromised, it won't." She looked at him. "You keep saying that. And I keep being right," he said, without heat, without arrogance. Just the flat statement of someone reporting an observable pattern. She turned back to the feed. At the 17-minute mark, Elijah opened the communication line to the dark team. "We are 7 minutes out. Northeast approach, as discussed. Move the package to the upper edge of the formation. We coming above you, not below. Confirm." A pause. Then the team lead's voice, compressed, controlled, with the specific steadiness of someone who has been in a contested position for several hours and is running on discipline and training. "Confirmed. Package is mobile. Upper formation in 4 minutes. Copy," Elijah said. "Keep the line open." The transport banked slightly, adjusting course. Outside the narrow viewport, the terrain below had shifted from flat desert to broken rock country. Irregular formations, deep shadow, the kind of landscape that swallowed movement and made everything uncertain at ground level. Elijah looked out for a moment and then looked back at his interface. 2 minutes, the pilot said over the internal line. The insertion was clean. The northeast approach came in above the rock formation from an angle the western hostile line didn't have visibility on, and the transport held a low hover for 40 seconds while the team moved, Elijah first, then the rapid response unit, then Ava, each of them dropping to the upper ledge of the formation and moving immediately into cover. The defector came next, assisted by 2 members of the dark team, and landed on the ledge with the awkward urgency of a civilian in a situation that had exceeded everything their life had prepared them for. Elijah had the defector's arm before the person had fully found their footing. "You're with me," he said. "Stay close, stay low, don't stop moving." The defector, a lean person in civilian clothes that had seen considerably better days, with the wide, exhausted eyes of someone who had been running for 72 hours, nodded and did not speak. The DAR team's lead came up beside Elijah. Western perimeter is aware of the transport sound. We have maybe 4 minutes before they reorient. Then we need 3, Elijah said. The route out was the same corridor Ava had identified on the satellite overlay. A narrow channel through the upper rock formation that opened onto a flat approach 300 meters out, where the transport would reposition for extraction. 300 meters of broken terrain in failing light, with 9 hostile signatures on the wrong side of a perimeter that was beginning to turn. They moved. The first 2 minutes were clean. Elijah led from the front, pace steady, reading the terrain with the focused attention of someone who had moved through worse than this in conditions that didn't allow for the luxury of satellite imagery or advanced preparation. The defectors stayed close. The rapid response unit covered the flanks. The dark team handled the rear. Ava was behind the defector and 2 steps ahead of the rear guard. She was moving well, not with the mechanical precision of someone following a procedure, but with the adaptive, instinctive awareness of someone whose mind was still running operational calculations while her body handled the physical demands. At the 150-meter mark, she grabbed Elijah's arm. "Stop," she said. He stopped. The column stopped. She pointed left. In the rock face beside the corridor, barely visible in the shadow, was a gap. Not on any map, not visible on the satellite overlay because the angle had been wrong. A secondary passage, narrow enough that it would need to be moved through in single file, but cutting directly through a section of terrain that the main corridor had to loop around. It shaved 60 meters off the route and, more importantly, kept them below the ridge line that the Western hostiles were currently using as their reference point for the reorientation sweep. Elijah looked at it. He looked at the countdown in his head. He looked at the gap. "Move," he said. They moved through the gap single file. Elijah first, the defector second, the rest following. It was tight, and it was dark, and one member of the rapid response unit had to turn sideways to clear his shoulders, but they came through at the 240-meter mark instead of the 300, and when they cleared the rock face and came out onto the flat approach, the transport was already repositioning, its landing lights off, running dark and low against the deepening sky. Behind them, from the direction of the western perimeter, they heard movement. Not close, but not distant. "Double time," Elijah said. They ran. The transport touched down for 35 seconds. Everyone boarded. The door sealed. The engines pushed, and the aircraft lifted, banking hard northeast, clearing the terrain with the specific urgency of a machine being asked to do something quickly by someone who was not going to accept slowly as an answer. Below, on the flat approach, hostile signatures arrived at the extraction 0.19 seconds after the transport's wheels left the ground. 19 seconds. Elijah sat in the transport with his eyes closed for a moment. The defector was beside him, breathing hard, hands shaking with the release of sustained fear. The dark team lead was running a head count. Everyone was present. Everyone was intact. Ava sat across from him. She was looking at him with an expression that had been building for hours and had finally settled into something she could name. Not awe. She was too precise for awe. Recognition. The recognition of someone who has watched a thing operate at the full extent of its capability and has understood, clearly and without romanticism, exactly what they were watching. Elijah opened his eyes and found her looking at him. "The gap in the rock," he said. "I wouldn't have seen it from the front." "No," she agreed. "Good call." She nodded. She looked out the viewport at the dark terrain below and said nothing more. She didn't need to. Iron Ridge Base in the morning looked like a place that had decided, overnight, to pretend that the previous day had been ordinary. The generators ran at their standard pitch. Personnel moved through the yard on their normal routes. The checkpoint at the main gate processed vehicles with the routine efficiency of a system that had not, 12 hours ago, been locked down by a command override that no one on base had authorized. But the pretense only held at surface level. Underneath it, in the way people moved and spoke and avoided certain topics in certain rooms, the base carried the specific residue of a day that had changed the reference points of everyone who had been present for it. Some things, once witnessed, don't permit the same relationship with ordinary that existed before. The defector had been transferred within 2 hours of the transport's return. a handoff so quiet and so fast that most of the base never knew it had happened. A vehicle, a team, a route that Elijah had organized from the command interface before the transport had even landed. The nuclear codes were out of hostile reach. The mission was complete. Black Veil was, in every sense that mattered, over. Elijah spent the first hour back at Iron Ridge doing administrative work, the specific, unglamorous paperwork of an operations closeout. Routing confirmations, personnel logs, after-action timestamps. Ava helped without being asked, and together they moved through it with the efficient quiet of people who had been working in close coordination long enough to anticipate each other's next step. When it was done, Elijah closed the command interface, sealed the black case, and sat for a moment in the operations center that had been the center of everything and was now just a room with screens and chairs and the faint smell of hours of sustained effort. Colonel Harris was removed from command quietly. No announcement, no ceremony. His authorization codes were deactivated at 0600, and by 0800 a temporary command structure had been established pending a formal review that would happen at a level significantly above Iron Ridge. The routing logs, the 68-hour surveillance pattern, the 3-block command signals, all of it had been packaged and transmitted to the appropriate oversight body the previous evening, while the extraction was still running by Elijah from the command interface. Harris's personal effects were moved from the command office by mid-morning. The office sat empty for the rest of the day with the door closed, the way rooms sit empty when they are between one thing and whatever comes next. His career did not survive the review. His service record was amended in ways that would never be publicly visible, and his name was removed from the operational chain of every mission he had been associated with in the preceding 3 years. He disappeared from the institutional record with the quiet thoroughness of a system that knows how to erase things when it needs to. It was not justice in any satisfying, visible sense. It was the kind of consequence that happens in rooms that no one outside them ever hears about, which was, in the world Elijah operated in, the only kind that was available. Briggs found Elijah near the vehicle bay in the late morning, when the base had settled into its secondary routine and the intensity of the previous day had receded to the background frequency of an institution returning to itself. He came without an agenda that was visible. He walked up and stood there for a moment, which was honest, and then he said, "I owe you an apology." Elijah looked at him. "Not the qualified kind," Briggs said. "Not the kind where I tell you I followed protocol, and the protocol was wrong, and therefore I was technically correct in some narrow way." He paused. "I made bad calls. I let ego run when I should have escalated. I put the mission at risk because I was more interested in being right than being correct." He held Elijah's gaze through all of it. "I'm sorry." Elijah was quiet for a moment. "I've seen that choice made by better officers than you," he said finally, "in situations with less pressure. You're not the first person who confused confidence with competence in a high-stakes moment." A pause. "You won't be the last." Briggs absorbed that. "Is that forgiveness?" "It's context," Elijah said. "Forgiveness is yours to decide you need or don't need. That's not my job." He looked at Briggs steadily. "Next time someone hands you something you don't recognize, something that doesn't fit your map of how things work, listen before you act. The thing you don't recognize isn't automatically a threat." Briggs nodded. He stayed a moment longer, as if there were more to say, and then concluded that there wasn't, and left. Elijah watched him go. He didn't call after him. There was nothing left to add. Ava's promotion came through in the early afternoon. A formal notification delivered to her through standard channels, which meant someone with appropriate authority had moved quickly. The promotion was a step above her current rank, with a classification flag attached to the new assignment that she didn't have clearance to read yet, but that she understood, from the structure of the flag, was above what her current tier permitted. She was in the intel bay when Elijah found her, reading the notification on her screen with the particular expression of someone who had expected something and was still slightly surprised to find it real. "Congratulations," he said. She looked up. "Did you do this?" Recommendations went up the chain. Someone agreed. "That's not an answer. It's the answer you're getting." He sat down in the chair beside her station. The assignment attached to that flag, You won't be able to read it fully for another 72 hours when your new clearance processes. But it puts you in a structure where you'll be operational, not just analytical. She looked at the notification, then at him. Is it Phantom Division? He looked at her for a moment. That's not something I can confirm or deny from a chair in the intel bay of Iron Ridge Base. But you're not denying it. I said I'm not confirming or denying it. A small pause. She almost smiled. Understood. He stood. She watched him and then asked the question she had been holding since the transport, since the rock formation, since the corridor outside the operations center, where he had confronted Harris with the cold precision of someone who had never needed volume to be powerful. Who are you, really? He stood for a moment at the edge of her station, and this time he didn't deflect it or redirect it or give her the operational non-answer that she'd learned to recognize. He looked at her with the direct, unguarded clarity of someone who has decided that a particular person has earned a particular truth. I built it, he said. Phantom Division. The architecture, the operational structure, the clearance framework, the command protocols that override every chain you've ever worked inside. 12 years ago, I spent 18 months writing a proposal that no one with conventional institutional authority would ever have approved, and submitted it to the 4 people on the planet who had the authority to approve it without institutional oversight. A pause. They approved it. Ava was still. I built it because the systems that existed were creating the problems they were supposed to prevent. Political chains of command, documentation requirements, institutional accountability structures. They're necessary for governance. They're catastrophic for certain categories of crisis. The kind where the acknowledgement of a problem is itself a trigger for the problem getting worse. He looked at her steadily. Phantom Division exists to operate in that space, to fix the things that governments can't publicly admit are broken, to prevent the wars that never appear in any history because they never started. Ava thought about that, about the defector, about the nuclear codes and the 3 nations and the hostile signatures that had arrived at the extraction 0.19 seconds too late, about the 47-minute command gap that had come within a margin she didn't want to calculate of becoming something that could not have been recovered from. Does it work? She asked. You came home last night, Elijah said. So did the defector. So did the dark team. A pause. The codes are secure. The war that almost started, the one none of the people who almost started it will ever know almost started, didn't. He picked up the black case. That's the metric. He left Iron Ridge in the early evening, when the desert light had gone gold and the base had fully settled back into its rhythms. No ceremony, no formation, no official acknowledgement of what had happened or who had made it possible, which was consistent with every operational closeout in Phantom Division's history and with Elijah's explicit preference for all of them. He walked through the central yard with the black case at his side, past the checkpoint where Sergeant Cole was on duty, and did not make eye contact with the man he had told 12 hours ago, "You barely get to breathe here." Past the vehicle bay where Briggs had offered his apology. Past the intel bay where Ava was already reading the background documentation for her new assignment. At the main gate, he paused. Not from sentiment. Sentiment was not an operating currency in his line of work. He paused because his encrypted device had activated in his vest pocket the specific vibration pattern of a priority alert on the classified channel. He took it out. Read the screen. A new alert. A new designation. Coordinates, a brief operational summary. A threat assessment that put the situation in a tier that required immediate attention and a particular kind of operative to provide it. He looked at it for a moment, the way he looked at all of it, with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who has never found a reason to look away from the things that other people can't look at. Then he put the device back in his pocket and walked through the gate. The transport aircraft waiting on the outer pad was a different one than the previous night, smaller, faster, built for distance rather than insertion. The crew was already aboard. The engines were warm. The door was open. He climbed in. The door closed. Through the small porthole, as the aircraft began to move, the lights of Iron Ridge Base receded. The checkpoint lights, the runway lights, the steady pulse of the communications tower that had, 12 hours ago, been running someone else's signals. Just lights now. Just a base in a desert, going about its evening. Elijah turned away from the porthole. He opened the encrypted device again and began reading the full alert. Somewhere ahead of him, in a situation that had not yet become a crisis, but was moving toward one with the specific momentum of things that don't stop on their own, something needed to be done that the official record would never show. He was already thinking about how to do it. The aircraft lifted, banked east, and was absorbed by the darkening sky. The last light on its tail blinked twice and disappeared. Some soldiers fight wars. Others make sure they never begin. If the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody sees coming, what does that say about the assumptions we make before we even ask a question? If this story made you think, hit like and subscribe. There's more where that came from.